Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming out to this particular event. My name is Anthony Bogues, Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. The Debra L lectures serves as a central component of the university's response to the report of the Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice, and invites the most distinguished scholars to Brown to discuss the historic and contemporary issues relating to the legacy of slavery in the Americas and the world. Today, we have one of America's most distinguished scholars, Professor Deborah Willis. The lecture is made possible by the generous donation of Miss Debra L, an alumni of Brown 76, and who's also currently the president of BET and serves as an external member, member of the board of the external advisors to the center. And so we should thank Ms. L for her generous donation. Professor Deborah Willis is the chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of Arts in New York, at New York University. Professor Willis has an affiliated appointment as a university professor with the College of Arts and Sciences, Africana Studies, also at NYU. She has been the recipient of many awards, Guggenheim, Fletcher, and MacArthur, the Genius Award, the Infinity Award, as well as writing from the International Center for Photography, and the recipient of the anonymous Was a Woman Award Foundation. She has been named as one of the most important persons in photography by the American Photography magazine. And she is one of the nation's leading historians of African American photography and curators of African American culture. I think, in my view, she is in fact one of the nation's most distinguished scholars. Her book, which I'm told we sold out of today, The Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, is a remarkable text. It is a pioneering work in which she works with another scholar, in which they amass over 150 photographs, some of them never been published before, from the antebellum days of the 1850s through the New Deal era of the 1930s. The scholars involved in this project vividly display the importance of emancipation and African Americans born before and after the proclamation. And they provide a specific perspective on freedom and slavery, and a way, and this to me is the most fascinating thing, and a way to understand photographs as documents of engagement, of struggle, of action, of aspiration, and I would argue, of finding self. From the photographs of the enslaved on plantations to African American soldiers and camp workers in the Union Army, to the June celebrations, slave reunions, and portraits of black families and workers in the American South, the book really presents to us a series of images that challenges our perceptions about slavery, and also, I would argue, challenges our perceptions about freedom. They show not only what the subjects emphasize about themselves, but also the ways in which Americans of all colors and genders, how they opposed or supported slavery, and how this marked American life. The title of her lecture today is Visualizing Freedom, Photography, and Emancipation. And I can't think of a better person in this nation to give this lecture with this title and to give the annual Debra L lecture for 2014. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Willis. Professor Willis.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a wonderful introduction to tonight, as well as to the history of the images I've been working on for a number of years. So if we can have lights just that side. No. It was, put then that one down, right? Okay, that's it, right. So I wanted to share research and think about the way that I have, let's try to put this here. So we all know how the historical gaze has basically transformed the history of how we see and imagine history, how we see history and imagine history. And so this talk focuses on this historical gaze. But central to my work for the past some odd years, I've looked at the Black body and how the Black body is perceived and how it has been described in history. And so I wanted to consider ways of telling this story through the early images of photography in this country as well as in Brazil. I've been fascinated with how images of work are a central way of reimagining caricatures, but also reimagining the individuals that we see who've been photographed. So the idea that Frederick Douglass wrote this statement and says that the servant girl can now see a likeness of herself, such as noble ladies. Just at the beginning of photography, so that now photography has access to women who are servants, who are people who can walk into the photographic studio, and it's not just for the class, the upper class. So in reading and writing this moment, in terms of reading the image, as Frederick Douglass has read this image, he sees that it's important that women and men from all states of status of life could spend time in the photographic studio and create a new sense of biography. So using that text, I decided to focus on this image here of an unidentified washerwoman. And she is a woman who was put on, who worked with the Union Army as a washerwoman. But as we can see that as thinking about Frederick Douglass's point, the servant girl can now see her likeness of herself, such as noble ladies, but we see her nobility. We see her not as a servant girl, but as a woman who proudly worked with the Union Army. She has the American flag pinned to her chest and the U.S. brass button. So and Barbara and I have spent a number of years talking about images and reconsidering this. And I research a lot of images, and when I discovered this image in D.C., I was fascinated with her pose as she looks directly into the camera. And she's giving us and sending us a message about her emancipation and how she envisions emancipation, freedom and patriotism, as we see in this pose. Her arm resting on the table, her dress, and then the U.S. brass button on her breast. We begin to see how women are beginning to imagine themselves, but then also with this wonderful image of Frederick Douglass. And he also uses the text, and there are a number of wonderful quotes by Frederick Douglass that could just central a whole history of photography. And he says, "Once you let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States." So considering these epigraphs and these moments of history, but also considering these ideas through the text and words of Frederick Douglass, I think of history and memory The slavery and emancipation has endured the bodies of these lived experience of former enslaved people, but also free people. And with this experience, with the 150th anniversary that happened last year, began to reconsider this history. But at the same time, I started researching for a number of years ago, looking at images from the past in Brazil. And this is a photograph by Mark Perez, who is a Brazilian photographer who photographed enslaved men and women on coffee plantations and sugarcane fields in that area. But he also photographed market women, women who were traders, women who traveled throughout Brazil, and then also the aspect of looking at Brazil as one of the largest countries in terms of moving to this hemisphere with black bodies in terms of that experience. But we see that Brazil also, slavery ended in Brazil later than this country, 20 some odd years later, but we see that photography craft of photography lasted longer and perfected with the camera and as well as with the equipment. And so we see how photography has transformed. We see this woman, and we look at fashion, we look at the experience of culture through the photographic image, through this pose. We can see that her head wrap, and so there's a sense of memory in her past in the history. This is also just one wonderful image that I see that is just a story that is both difficult as we consider the history of slavery, but we also see the presence of these black bodies working, posing, giving a sense of placement of these young women, some who are pregnant. And one of the fascinating images that people have asked me over the years, have you ever found images of black women pregnant who are photographed in months of pregnancy, large months, later months of pregnancy? Sorry, but just focusing on that, noticing that that's found in Brazil with this sense of placement. So, but we see the land, we see the hills, but we also see this kind of work that is idealized in this portrait of workers in Brazil. So these are the range of images that, well, I'll explore. The act of saving and preserving photographs. I really think it's important to think about how photographs are a sense of a biblical moment, that photographs are like the Bible, when we know that family preserve photographs in their family album as well as in the Bible. But during that period when publishers created photographic albums, they were also considering the notion of the Bible with making it leather bound, but also gold lettering within, and then turning the pages that were central to this history, but also creating this bound volume. In the 1850s, there was a photographer by the name of Augustus Washington, and he was an abolitionist. He had a studio in Hartford, Connecticut. He photographed many of the abolitionist members in that city, but also in New York. He traveled often, and he believed in America as a place to live. But he was disappointed after a while and decided to move to Liberia. Living in Liberia, he photographed families. And this is the McGill family, one of the McGill family members. And he is a merchant who often traveled throughout the west coast of Africa, selling dried meat and furs, as well as fish. We also know that the McGill family brothers also sold silk. And so they were traders in a major way. But we also see that this photographer who's photographing black people who left America from Baltimore in the 1840s and 50s, lived there as an opportunity to transform their lives as free people, and then Augustus Washington making a document about their lives. And so these are images from that period, but also kind of reconsidering how photographs in Africa were created of black people. And this is his sister, and Sarah McGill. We see her holding a daguerreotype case. So this is months, possibly after the death of her husband. His name was Samuel Rushworm. And here we see her with a mourning, as if she's in mourning. We see she's wearing lace gloves. We see she's sending a message about her status, but also that she's wearing hoop earrings. We see a sense of style. Images that presented during this period of Black people were always caricatures in the larger arena. And that's why that family album is so important, because the images that circulated within the family reproduce the idea of family, introduce the idea of humanity through that experience. One of the early images that brought Barbara and I together in this research project was this image here of Dolly. And it's a carte de visite. Dolly is, we see her as a self-emancipated woman. It's a runaway slave ad, $50 reward. And it says that Dolly ran away from the yard corner of Jackson and Broad Street in Augusta, Georgia, on the evening of Tuesday, 7 April 1863. And it says a woman, Dolly, and Dolly in quotes, whose likeness is seen here. She's 30 years of age, light complexion, hesitates somewhat when spoken to, and is not a very healthy woman, but rather good looking with a fine set of teeth. Never changed her owner. And so this idea that she has been a servant, she has been loyal, but she was enticed off by some white man, being herself a stranger to the city. So we were really intrigued with this image, that he had her photographed during her lifetime living with him, that she's in a photographic studio. We see that, and it's a photographic studio of some substance, because we can see the chair in the backdrop, that he cuts the photograph in half, pastes it on the top of the line sheet, and has it on display at the police station. So it's $50 reward for her return, owner of Dolly, underlined, underscored, and in parens. So he's saying in this lecture and this ledger is that he feels betrayed by Dolly, who has, quote, never left his side. And so we see this kind of dynamics going on with this slave ad, but this is the first runaway slave ad that we found with a photographic image. And we see her looking, defiant in the photograph, and her head wraps. And so we see another style. In terms of fashion, it's a really important for a way of reading this history through fashion and women in terms of creating a history. And that's one we see with the head wrap from Brazil as well as with Dolly. But at the same time, these images circulated during slavery and during the Civil War period. We see that Black bodies were on display. This is a stereograph card that's seen through a stereograph viewer, and it looks three-dimensional when you see it together. But in this one image, when you see one, you can see that it says auction, Negroes and Negro sales. We see that Black bodies were sold right next to China, that Black bodies were seen as objects. And so it's a conundrum as we think about how these bodies circulated, but also how these bodies were viewed. And this is in Atlanta, Georgia. So we see this experience through the history of photographic images. One of the other images that we found that was important for us to share stories about women, the Edmondson Sisters. And this is a photograph of two women. You can see them in their plaid. There's a crowd, one of the outdoor scenes of a daguerreotype in the 1850s. This is an anti-slavery rally. But thinking about how this image is told through the voice of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass is seated at the table, and these two women are about to tell their story. And they're telling their story about running away and getting away. that they were about to be sold into slavery further south, from Washington, from Baltimore further south to New Orleans. And because they were beautiful girls, that they were going to be sold into prostitution. And their father had tried to purchase them, and it was not allowed, and so a group of people got together and able to purchase them, and so that they could find freedom. And as a result, they lectured about their experience when they were enslaved, but also about the possibilities, how they were caught on the ship and how they had to, in Virginia, and how they ran away. And this is their story. And then they performed the story often as they spoke. But we also see it was important for women to have a certain style and a sense of respectability when they spoke in public, specifically, Black women. And also religion, images of church scenes, images of Christ central to this moment. This is in Columbia, South Carolina. This is during slavery, the experience of having and documenting church services, also often looked and viewed with white slave owners on the far left, as you can see, but we also see families and children praying at the altar. So the range of images that we found of women, young girls working for the photographer and working with the family, holding the children of the family, unknown images, unidentified, but images such as this type of image by J.T. Zealy, who was hired by Louis Agassiz to photograph enslaved, firstborn, American-born and African-born Blacks in the South Carolina area. We see that Zealy photographed them, and we can also see that the bottom of the dresses and pants are exposed, part of the framing, so that this sense of entitlement for the photographer, but also J.T. Zealy and Agassiz are looking at these bodies as inferior, and the idea of how these bodies are used to show inferiority within white race and Black race. Carrie Mae Weems decided to look at these images and reconsider and repurpose these images. And she's asking the question, she uses a red tint, and she says you became a scientific subject, an anthropological debate, a Negroid type, and a photographic subject. So the Black body is constantly going through a transformation. She uses this dramatic red as a bloodline in the framing of the image. But the original image by J.T. Zealy, who had he was in Columbia, South Carolina, who had a major studio, one of the most important studios in that area. But he also, it's at Harvard, the collection is 15 daguerreotypes. One fascinating part about the collection is that the tags, that the labels are still a part of the collection, and they're part of within the framing. So we see Jack, and he's considered, his work is driver, originally from Guinea, plantation of the B.F. Taylor, Esquire, and then in Columbia, South Carolina. So we see Jack, and we see his work. We also see his body in the type, his body type. Deborah Priestley, another artist, looking at these early images and also creating his kind of a moment of thinking about how do we preserve memory in mason jars and that history within the mason jar. So she uses the mason jar to put photographs that circulated of young women holding white babies, but also the runaway slave ad, and then the constraints of slavery, and just different moments of people like Sojourner Truth. But using these mason jars, we can see a way of how contemporary artists are thinking about memory and preserving memory through this experience of preserving. And we see with the upper right here, with the constraints and the tortured experience, we also see this with Wilson Chin. And as a photographer who photographed Wilson Chin, there are two photographers posing him in different ways. We see the neck brace. We also see the paddle that many have been whipped with. We also see the chains, the leg chain, the leg irons. But we see Wilson as in his suit, but also posing as a way of showing these constraints with the experience of slavery, but through the lens and discussion of the abolitionist movement. So a lot of these images circulated with the abolitionist movement in terms of ending the discussion and bringing a discussion about slavery through a public arena. Lectures were, many of them lectured, and some of these children, these are, it says, emancipated slaves brought from Louisiana, and they were sent to Philadelphia to be photographed, in New York to talk about their experience of enslavement. But we see the reason why they were photographed. They were light-skinned children who were known as the children of their slave master, but also mothers and brothers and sisters with, with the same family with dark skin and light skin, and that these bodies were also a part of this discussion of slavery. And should these light-skinned, white-skinned bodies be enslaved? And how do you preserve this and end this slavery based on this experience of these children? We see that Wilson is also a part of this discussion of learning. This is learning is wealth. Wilson, Charlie, Rebecca, and Rosa. These images also circulated with this image, with these two images, and one of the fascinating parts is this: as we found them and as they are now. And these are abolitionists and the Union Army, Union soldiers working together. As we found them, their mother is pleading that the Union Army take her children as she is sold into slavery in the lower South. The children are ragged, shoeless, forlorn. Here we see the sense of hope that the children now are dressed, they're wearing shoes, and so this is the experience. So we educate these children, and we hope a future will change for them. So this is a part of this, how photographs were used during this time. Images also by Sojourner Truth, as she says, I sell the shadow to support the substance. And she is lectured about the experience of slavery, but also that she sold photographs. And so using that poetic way of reading the shadow, her body, and the substance, the experience of slavery and her own body. But also looking at her, how she's posed. She has a shawl, she has a handbag, she's walking with a cane, and so she's a lecturer, and we see her as a public figure and reforming and changing the experience of slavery. Frederick Douglass is known as one of the most important persons in terms of looking at photography as a way of thinking about photography, and he has over 200 photographs made during his lifetime that two British historians are writing about, and I think the book will be out next year, but they found over 200 images. But we see him in terms of his dress. We see that as an orator, that he is speaking through his clothes. He's identifying as a dignified man and also as a dandy in many of the other photographs. But we also see that as he presents himself as a humanitarian and as human, that we see that he is asking the viewer to change and reconsider their images of Black people. He also was part of this call for the 54th to fight for and join the Army. So here's an ad to the colored men to join the 54th, and not only in Massachusetts, but in Connecticut, Ohio, and here in Rhode Island. So there were a number of places. His son, Lewis, two of his sons also fought, and Lewis is one. Here he is posed in the photographic studio, but also he is posed here later on, and he writes a letter, and it's really fascinating to think about how Frederick Douglass's son is writing to his girlfriend, his then fiance, says, "My dear Amelia, I've been in 2 fights." He's at Fort Wagner. "I've been in 2 fights and am unhurt. I'm about to go to another, I believe, tonight. Our men fought well on both occasions. The last was desperate. We charged that terrible battery on Morris Island known as Fort Wagner and were repulsed with a loss of 3 killed and wounded. I escaped unhurt. Perfect hail of shots and shells, but it was terrible. I need not particularize the page in this letter about the experience, but my thoughts are with you. If I survive, I shall write you a long letter. DeForest of your city is wounded. George Washington is missing. Jacob Carter is missing. Charles Reese is wounded. Charles Whiting and Charles Creamer are all wounded, and they're all in the hospital. So just imagine that he is writing to his fiancée, and he says, he ends the letter, "My dear girl, I hope again to see you. I must bid you farewell. Should I be killed, remember if I die in a good cause. I wish we had 100,000 colored troops. We would put an end to this war. Goodbye to all. Write soon. Your own loving Lewis." Considering this experience and thinking about this soldier on the right as he is writing this letter, to this sense of hope that he had for his future bride. But the way that he's posed, his hat is on the table, his arms are posed in this sense of manliness and pose. But then receiving, sometimes most of his, we all know what happened with the 54th at Fort Wagner, but he survived Fort Wagner and had malaria sometime later, I think a year later, so he had to leave and was hospitalized, but they eventually married. But just the actual humanizing these experiences and stories are really, really important for us. And then in Ohio, when the 54th were called to fight, when black soldiers were called to fight and join the 54th, there were soldiers who in Ohio who were planning to move east to Massachusetts, and the Ohio said, no, we're going to have our own volunteer army in the 127th. Here is a pose in 1863. So here are a group of black soldiers ready to join the regiment. And so when we think about emancipation, we think about the Civil War, we also know the importance of how black and some abolitionists worked together to take care and help runaways and self-emancipated women. This is a young woman who was in Kentucky who ran away, and these are 2 soldiers who guided her to Wisconsin. And they went into a black photographer studio, J.P. Ball in Cincinnati, and they're holding their gun to their breast as in sense of bravery, that we've guided her this far, we're here in Cincinnati, and we're moving north. And so reading this image, we initially thought this was a strange image where they're holding a gun to her head, that sense of reading this history, but then finding the history behind the photograph helped us reconsider and know the story, that she was initially dressed as a boy so that she could move easily through the lines of going from south to north. And then when she visited the photographer's studio as a 15-year-old young woman, she's dressed in a hat and fancy skirt. We also know Harriet Tubman's story, and we see her posed here, and then the librarian has nurse, spy, and scout. Other images that circulated, Moore's image on the Hopkins plantation, we see sweet potato planting, but also when you see later on, you see some of the images in the baskets that were in Brazil, we see the same type of baskets that are here in South Carolina. So we think about where blacks who were taken out of West Africa, similar cultural traditions stayed and were retained. And they're posing with the hose and just different types of dress and style. And these are families. So circulating, how these images circulated. These are images that were used to tell a story of a family leaving and joining the Union troops. and that they were sold as souvenirs for families, to images of soldiers going into the studio as they joined the Army, that they decided to be photographed for their families, but also for themselves as they shared moments. They decided on backdrops that could told stories of bravery and patriotism. We see here of Fleetwood, Christian Fleetwood. We also see this wonderful diary where he writes about the experience of one night. And he says in the diary, it's just a wonderful, June 15, 1864, up at break of dawn, underway of our division, white troops of General Smith went into action, early charged, out of woods, cut up badly, regiment broke and retreated, fired into the 5th Mass, charged with 22nd, and then goes on to say, lay under fire, final charge at seven guns taken by our regiment, our loss pretty heavy. Slept, moved outside, slept till morning, moved to the rear and rested, chaplain about. So here, this describing his daily experience. These are, when I studied history, this was not a part of my history. This story of blacks who were part of their own emancipation was never shared in my history classes. And so that this diary is part of a collection and an archive that actually transformed the idea of manhood and Civil War. Different types of posing from the Ohio, 120th in Ohio, to images of a young man who was a farmer, whose father decided that his son should be a part of the 54th. And we see him posed. He's standing tall. He's over 6 feet. But then that experience of what happens with this young man in his uniform, it's tinted, it's hand-colored. He dies within months because of the experience of disease, because of dysentery, and it's unclean. And so we see him, his name is Sergeant Henry F. Stewart. He's 23 years old, from Adrian, Michigan. This is 4 April 1863. He died of disease in the hospital in Morris Island in South Carolina. He entered 4 April 1863. He died 27 September 1863. You notice the ad with the bounty. His estate was paid a $50 bounty at his death. So again, we see photographic studios. We see black soldiers, one waiting. This is a favorite photograph of mine. We can see how men related to each other. One posed and the other standing in the frame, waiting to be a part of it. But also reframing this and matting this, that the photographer did not cut the other soldier out. So there's a sense of relationships that are developed within this framing. Different ways of dress and manhood are posed within this frame. You can see him holding the gun. We see, this is Camp William Penn outside of Philadelphia, large troops. We see Kearney, as he was the person who ran and saved the flag, the color guard. We see young soldiers holding rifles. And then the experience of one of my favorites in terms of research is finding a story where there are 2 soldiers, lieutenants, who one sends a photograph home to his mother of the black troops that he has in his camp. And they are here, they send this photograph album, and then they send notes about each one. This one, he says, his name is Redwick Allen. He's now a sergeant, an excellent one, and commands obedience. So we begin to see how the 2 lieutenants are reviewing and assessing these men as their soldiers. This one is Henry Lively. He's the best man in the company. The handwritten notes on the back. are just fascinating way. He's one, this is Henry Price, one of the cooks, does his duty faithfully to the satisfaction of the men. And so we begin to see how they are read and assessed. And this is Sergeant Alfred Jackson, USC T-108, free man in the Army. As a Teamster, is considered one of the best sergeants in the regiment. And Samuel Martin, very light eyes, hair and light complexion, uses no tobacco, no stimulant, soldierly, and appreciated by his officers. So we begin to see how men are beginning to see and pose within the frame. And this is Emmett Adams, reads well, makes the morning reports of the company, and by his diligence and good conduct has won the esteem of his officer. He was a tobacconist. So we see the type of work that the men experienced when they were before they entered in the service, and then after. And my favorite is, this is James Roberts, drummer, was a free man, hard to manage, and is now bass drummer, stubborn and reckless. So look at his hat. You know, look how he is posed. I mean, you can see that he is in control of his image as he circulates through this. And I love the idea that he is stubborn and reckless. Images that circulated also in the newsprint of this image here of Gordon, who is also known as the Scourge Back. We see him as he entered the camp in his clothes, as he ran from the plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana, and then as a soldier. Not found the image of him as a soldier, but we know that through the work of Thomas Morris Chester, that he's the only black journalist that was part of the Civil War, that he's written about the experience of the Civil War soldiers as they entered the city of Richmond, as they entered different camps, but through his voice, and there's a small book about him, and it's just wonderful to see how he is viewed. He also lived in Monrovia in Liberia in the 1850s and worked as a lawyer. But we see that he is writing about the experience of the soldiers. And these are just some other images posed through women who worked as nurses and taught. These are families who are freeing and running away from plantations, not knowing what's next for their lives, but they have their horse and buggies and families and clothing. And family, a central way of looking at this history. And different ways of reading freedom. You know, I know you smiled. That's exactly what I did when I first saw this image. You know, I smiled because I can see this is a self-emancipated woman. You know, this is an 8x10 tintype, rare. Most of the tintypes are 2x4, 2x2. But we can see how her style of dress, how she's posed in the studio, is hand-colored. So we see this woman as a woman who is emancipated and free. Also, images such as this type of image made right after emancipation. In the studio, is the studio gate a part of a metaphor of freedom, as entering into a new life? I mean, how are these props used to tell their personal stories? We also know that Emancipation Day celebrations were central to an experience of freedom. This is a banner with Frederick Douglass, with Abraham Lincoln on the side, but we also see a man, what Frederick Douglass described, of owning your property, having your family, educating your children. And this is what freedom meant to these families. This is in Richmond in 1888. Also, Pap Singleton in Nicodemus, Kansas. We can see the town and the townspeople, the first store that was built, and we see the notion of the exodusters, what happened to these families when they were free and they moved west. Another 1905 Emancipation Day celebration in Richmond, Virginia, large crowds, children, following the sound of music. We can see and experience that moment. Monuments were really central. This is in Rochester, New York, and this is a monument to Frederick Douglass. Public monument, but we also see the crowds that attended these kind of unveilings, this experience for emancipation. This is a monument to Frederick Douglass, to Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., that Frederick Douglass spoke at this unveiling, but also that many former enslaved people put money in for this monument. They shared their love and respect. And then finally, just ending some of the images in Brazil. I thought it was really important to consider ways of how, ways of photography told a different story based on the fact that the technology was right for the time in terms of longer framed images posed, and we see these groups. This large group, and this is following, this is also coffee. We can see woman here in the center is pregnant, but they're placed within this frame. You know, it's as if they're telling a story about their work. They work 14 hours a day, but their clothing and their style is still a part of the framing of their humanity. We see the baskets, as I mentioned before, the baskets of carrying the coffee beans. We also see that Mark Ferrez and Cristiano and Herschel, there were three known photographers in working between 1860 and 1888 in places like Bahia and in Sao Paulo and other places in Brazil. So we also know that women worked as traders and then vendors, but they also had their children with them. And what's fascinating about Brazil, that we rarely, in connection to America, we rarely had a chance to see Black women holding their own children when working. And we see this in Brazil. We see fancy dress in terms of Cristiano and this style and the fabric. We see, this is a young woman in Bahia. This is a photograph by Herschel in 1860. And Herschel, it was assumed that this was his concubine as it's posed, and within the framing of, and she lived in his house and she worked for him. But we see the aspect of the other images of the enslaved women who were posed, stripped, and we see the same with this figure here in Bahia. And then images with women with their pipes, with their fruit, with their gourds, with the umbrella. So we see these as tourists. A lot of tourists purchased these photographs and circulated them. Families together working, and also in the photographic studio. This is on a house, a veranda on a house. We see two children working. And again, we see a woman with a white child who's her charge, just music, and just different types of vendors. And these images, you know, as someone had said to me earlier, like Laura had said, these images are definitely in conversation with their histories, with their past histories. We see the exteriors, we see close-ups of families, we see work, and we see clotheslines, we see posed people. And this image here, as it ends, as I end with this image, with two men who are carrying this woman who, in the title of this, are Two Slaves with a Lady. And so unidentified, but just a fascinating read of this history of how bodies are seen. When I was in Brazil last year, someone had pointed out with this image that there is the freemen, the people who are working as paid laborers are wearing shoes, and they're in the back here, and then the people who were enslaved are shoeless, which I hadn't noticed, but it's something that I will continue to explore as I look at this history of photography and slavery in Brazil. So I'd like to end with that and open up for questions. I'll take it. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm assuming for the most part, the photographers would have been white. Is that true? Do you have any sense of that?
There are only two that I found that, as I mentioned, one was J.P. Ball in Cincinnati, who was black and had a studio in Cincinnati, and the other was Augustus Washington, who had a studio in Hartford and later in Liberia. The rest are all white photographers.
And do you have any sense that this might contribute to the way the images across how the bodies are posed?
Some, and I really believe that with the Civil War soldiers, that they worked in collaboration with the photographers. I believe that when they entered the studio, that they knew the story that they wanted to tell about their manhood and their sense of seeking freedom by joining the army and the uniform. And so I think that was a collaboration. Yes?
You mentioned the change in technology over this period. How much did photographic technique change? Rapid period of rapid development of slavery?
Well, the early images were daguerreotypes, and so they were single images. So they were not repeatable. We couldn't reproduce them. And so that the images are rare today. They took hours to make. They had to coat the plate with a solution. It was dangerous. And then after the print process, you could reproduce because you had paper prints and negatives, glass plate negatives. So you were able to reproduce. And that's when the images of the tourist scenes that I showed, the stereographs, that they were sold to people who were curious about these free black bodies moving north, these free black bodies that were controlled by slavery. And so the images that had the stereotype images of blacks that I never show, that because they're circulated so often, where blacks are seen as alligator bait or lazy or eating watermelon, they circulated and they were repeated and repeated so often that people believed the images of blacks who were useless, as they could see, and always stealing. And it's fascinating because the images here in Brazil of blacks working, and labor, it's just a little different about the experience of blacks' images here in this country. But they circulated in the same way as tourists and curiosity. Yes?
I'm actually really interested in the provenance of some of the photos. Do you know if any of them were in the family collections of the people in the photos, or were they mainly in the collections of the studio?
What's happening is, we know that images, the photographer studios in Brazil, these were collectors, purchased these collections, and they are in the photographer studio as well as collectors. But we also know that images such as, this isn't a family album, okay? So we know that this is preserved for an individual and someone's family. And most of the other images are this was in a collection. This is at Cornell, and this was in a collector's archive in his name slips in my mind. Oh, okay. The lights. But this is the image of the woman in the large tintype. And so the image has changed as people purchase large collections. Specifically, photographers' collections were really significant in that way. So, and the images such as this is in an archive at the Schomburg Center. And so this is at Yale, and it's just in Beinecke. And it was also originally a collector's album, but it was purchased from the family of the Lieutenant Wright. So that's how some of them circulated. Yes.
I was interested when you actually showed the photo album.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, in your research, do you come across a lot of actual albums, or are they just separate?
No, some of them are albums, and some of them are removed because of preservation and conservation issues, but they a lot of them are still in albums. And just a fascinating binding, from velvet to leather, animal skin, with the prints such as this petrified wood guccia percha is part of the image of the daguerreotype, right, and the cased image. Yes.
Yes, I was interested in the photographs of the orphan children, and I wondered if those schools, I assume the
Quaker schools, yes.
if they also have records or
They have a fantastic,
museum or something.
fantastic collection, records. The Quakers have a large collection. Well, thank you. Okay, you had a question?
Yes, I have a question. I'm wondering about your take on contemporary images of African American bodies, specifically, I guess their relationship to trauma in American visual culture currently, and how they differ or relate in style and sensibility to these historical images.
I think that I think that today Black bodies are in crisis, and there are photographers and contemporary photographers artists who are looking at this crisis from images of people who have been photographed with there are women who are seen as objects and are allowed to be photographed as objects and enjoy the experience of that exchange. But then there are also young people who are critiquing these images and making, the new thing is selfies now, and that people are deciding that they want to make their images, and the images will speak in their language of their enjoyment of pleasure, enjoyment of seeing themselves within moments of a good time. But because the images that circulate are, so many are so demeaning, and the history is so strong that that they're in crisis. We look at advertising. There are campaigns in Harlem and in other cities, in Baltimore, where people in the community are changing the ads, and putting new faces on ads because they want to tell a story not about drinking alcohol or cigarettes in their community, but showing a sustained community in a different way. So I've been looking at it closely. My son is Hank Willis Thomas, and he really looks at images of Black bodies and critiques. He has a new show in South Africa looking at the history of South African photography, and said history is we can't laugh at history or something like that. But it's a way of collecting these images and asking questions about how the bodies are viewed. Yes?
Is there any like possible method or like slow motion approach to sort of reclaim the African American like image? Because I feel like in some way, like the more African Americans that are educated, they begin to be more conscious and begin to critique their own sensibilities and the way that they're projecting themselves. But do you see a method of like reclaiming? Do you see a method of sort of
I don't see it as reclaiming, but I think of the aspect of reappropriating, and I think that that's what's happening. There are people who can afford to buy images, people who are using the opportunity of exhibitions to show work, to have a different discussion about work, and having public programs. There's also, I know I'm a mom, but I'm also a curator. But I'm talking about my son's work a lot because he has a project called Question Bridge. So if any of you just Google questionbridge.com, where he has asked 350 men from different generations, different walks of life, about what it means to be Black and male. And each asks different questions and each answers. Some funny questions that are difficult questions about what it means, and through that exploration, I worked as a producer for the project. One guy said, why didn't you leave us a blueprint? And he asked another generation of men, and then Andy Young was the person who answered the question and said, we did leave you a blueprint. We gave you that blueprint. And then another man said, well, we did, but we dropped the ball. And then there's another kid who says that how can you do good when there's so much bad around you? What do you do? And then there's another man who asked the question is, why do you have that take mentality? So having that dialogue helps to broaden the discussion. They went into the prisons, they went into schools, they went into churches, just meeting people on buses and just asking different questions. So the hope with that is that you take one along and you keep the conversation going. I spoke at a college last month, a business college, and they looked at images, and I decided to show some advertising images of Black people. And they were pretty demeaning and questioning ideas about how Madison Avenue decides these images of Black people, and it's still part of the stereotype. And I said to the young people there, consider that you have a chance to go in the boardroom and you can change this. You can change the conversation. And they said, well, we are not even aware that it was a problem until you pointed it out, because advertising is so beautiful. It's so seductive that it's believable. And so, the change. So it has to happen continuing as we educate and as we, just have a critique often. Okay. Thank you.